Following the overturn of Roe v. Wade nearly a year ago, the FBI reportedly opened nearly 10 times as many investigations into cases of, quote, abortion-related domestic terrorism as it had in 2021, according to new reporting from the Intercept Ken Klippenstein.
The uptick allegedly follows pressure from major Republican lawmakers for the Bureau to pursue pro-abortion terrorism. Florida Senator Marco Rubio said last year pro-abortion terrorism sweeping the nation. Joining us now to discuss is investigative reporter at The Intercept, Ken Klippenstein. Ken, thank you for joining us.
Hey, great to be with you guys.
Yeah, so wonderful to talk to you. Tell us more about your reporting here, showing what law enforcement is trying to do with respect to the abortion protests.
Yeah, so the Justice Department's watchdog, the Inspector General, a couple weeks ago put out a report that it appears nobody read, and I'm very grateful for because this gave me a nice story to to run with. What this report found was that there was a huge increase in domestic terrorism cases against what's called abortion-related incidents. And so when you look at that number, it's almost a 10 times increase over the previous fiscal year, the biggest increase we've seen for the data that was present in the Inspector General report. And I think a reflection of the increasing focus on domestic terrorism as the war on terror draws down and the intelligence community has to find a new sort of mission focus.
So what do you say to folks who might be thinking, well, after Dobbs, obviously there were a lot of people who were very frustrated about the right to choose being stripped away, at least the federal protection of it, and therefore there are more violent incidents, attacks against anti-abortion advocates, and the FBI, of course, has to investigate those.
I would say they're right that there has been an uptick in violent incidents, but when you break down what those incidents are, many of them are ones that could be handled by state and local law enforcement. That there are plenty of laws on the books at the state and not federal level to prosecute them with. And when you look at a lot of the cases cited, which again they're right, there is cases of vandalism, and in one case a pro-life clinic was firebombed. What you find is that a lot of those cases could be handled by state and local statutes. The question, I think, is, do they have to be elevated to domestic terrorism? I really see this as a sort of mirror image case of what had been happening with the right. I mean, you see a lot of cases that the FBI is prosecuting as insurrection that probably could be prosecuted as vandalism or, other forms of laws that are already on the books. And so what I had hoped in doing this story was to, show people that when the FBI pursues this new mandate of domestic violent extremism, as they've both made very clear in public statements and also in the data about what it is that they're pursuing, there's been a huge increase over the last several years.
Yeah, it's interesting, the mandate to, look more closely at domestic extremism, domestic terrorism. I think there's a lot of buy-in to the idea, or broadly it's in the public, or it's among activist group, that there's a lot more extremist activity, especially on the right, that it motivates a whole lot of violence. Although when I look at the statistics, it then looks to me like it's actually not a fairly significant category of violence or crime in general is ideological motivation. I think we tend to over-focus on that. Is that kind of what's going on here?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, yeah. What's interesting is if you look at the FBI's internal policies, the way they define terrorism is different than the Department of Homeland Security, and indeed other national security agencies define it. So in the case of the Department of Homeland Security, they define it as being mass casualty event or the intention to produce one. And in the case of the FBI, they don't actually need that. It can be damage to property. It doesn't include that criteria. And so that leads to a lot of these cases being prosecuted. And what, to me, again, I'm not condoning violence, even against property, but that's a very different sort of crime than the kind that actually results in bodily harm, which Senator Rubio himself has conceded in the past. He says no one's been hurt yet. We need to get ahead of this threat before it happens. And so I really would like to see there be a debate that's bipartisan in nature, because when these agencies pursue domestic terrorism cases, the reality, if you talk to them, away from the cameras, is they'll say, yeah, if we've got 10 cases on one thing, we're under political pressure to produce at least a couple on the other side of the ledger to make it look like everything's fair. And I think the data shows pretty clearly that in cases of bodily harm, that greatly favors the pro-life, extremists, if you want to call it that. But on different issues, it varies. And so I think there needs to be an accounting of that reality that doesn't like to be discussed, which is that the FBI is under political pressure just like any other agency.
Yeah, the numbers that you include in your piece are really striking. You write that from 1993 to 2016, there have been 11 murders and 26 attempted murders carried out by anti-abortion advocates against pro-abortion advocates. In contrast, Michael Gurman, a former FBI agent and fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice's Liberty and National Security Program, says he was not aware of a single case of serious bodily injury by abortion rights advocates. And yet we're now seeing this tenfold increase in investigation into exactly those kind of issues. I mean, do you see this as kind of a wake-up call for some liberals who have been framing the movement to defund the FBI or to rein in the FBI, however you want to frame it, as a kind of right-wing effort to duck accountability, perhaps short-sightedly not acknowledging the extent to which that particular agency has historically disproportionately targeted the left?
Yeah, I think it should be. And unfortunately, we have two pieces of legislation before the House and the Senate to enshrine in the federal definition of domestic terrorism much broader criteria. And this has overwhelming support from the Democrats. The reason it hasn't passed yet is because there are some holdout Republicans. But, I don't think that it's something you can necessarily count on, that the Republicans aren't going to come around and support this, because, again, that grants authorities to these types of agencies that there seems to be broad bipartisan consensus in many respects to do so. And I wish there would just be some foresight about, if you want to look at how this approach to the threat was unrolled, there's a lot of focus on January 6th, but you have to go back even prior to that, which includes the civil unrest and riots during the George Floyd protests, to look at what led the FBI to respond in the way that it has. So it's really targeted at both the right and the left. And I think that's something that's not appreciated. And
not to mention these 42 Cop City activists that were charged with domestic terrorism, some of whom were just attending a concert, some of whom I believe were putting leaflets in mailboxes, really obviously protected First Amendment activity.
That's a really instructive case, because if you look at the particular statute they were charged under, that the nature of those charges, the criteria to be to be charged for domestic terrorism was changed after the Dylan Roof shooting. They expanded how that's defined. And, just me personally, if you left it up to me, what would happen to that guy? This video would get taken down, Roof. But, you also have to take a breath and think, okay, what affects downstream beyond this horrible individual that we all want to see punished for these crimes? What effect will that have down the road? And we're seeing that right now. It's that activists on the left now are being charged with these things since they've been broadened.
I testified before the House Civil Liberties Committee several years ago, and the questions from the squad members were most of them were part of that committee, and their interrogating was along the lines of, why aren't we expanding, why aren't we calling right-wing protesters, January 6th type people, why aren't we calling them terrorists, and why aren't we classifying more activity as terrorism rather than raising the civil liberties concerns of having the left-wing people or the Muslim people who are classified as terrorists? Like, it's not like the conversation moved from that's wrong to let's fix this by classifying more people as terrorists, which seems to me a very representative and concerning kind of example of where the Democratic response to this has gone.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think there's a kind of catharsis, like I was saying with the Dylan Roof case, to feel like you're really being tough on, heinous individuals. And I understand people's concerns on both sides. I don't want anyone, no matter their political views, to feel pressured by anything. This is what the country is supposed to be about. So I get it. I understand why people are so scared. But as always, when people are fearful, these agencies just come in and take advantage, and you give them an inch and they go a mile. And I wish that there would be a little bit more appreciation of that fact.
Yeah, thank you so much for this important reporting, Ken, and thanks for joining us as always.
Thanks, guys.